Yeah.
It's kind of like 100 now, so we'll start. Yeah. Welcome everybody. Thank you for participating in this webinar.
Morning.
Yeah. First, I have to ask all participants to mute their mics. And if they don't want to be recorded, you should also shut off your videos. Because, yeah, with the mics on, you get an echo. Now, this is part of the series of webinars that the Center for Development Economics and Sustainability at the Monash Business School at Monash University is running. The series, we call it the COVID-19 and beyond. And this one follows previous webinars on the impact on the poor, on gender, and we had a focused country one on India separately. And in this one, we're going to be looking at the non-India South Asia, the 4 smaller countries. And the webinar series actually has given us the opportunity to reach out and partner and establish links with researchers in the region. You know, it's a disaster for the world and for the region in many ways, but at least in that sense, this has been welcome, that it has given us the opportunity to move out and establish relationships with institutes and individuals in the region. And this one, as you would have seen, we are co-sponsoring with several institutions, the Asia Foundation in Bangladesh, the Institute for Integrated Development Studies in Nepal, the Institute of Policy Studies, and the Lakshman Kadiragama Institute of International Relations and Strategic Studies in Sri Lanka, and the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics in Pakistan. You have already got the list of panelists here. So I wouldn't spend much time introducing them. Dr. Nadim Al is Vice Chancellor of the PIDE. He has had a range of very interesting experiences, both in the region itself and globally. I was many years with the IMF, and I myself got to know Nadim when he spent several years as the IMF resident rep in Colombo, when he played a major role in getting through, working with business, government, etc., researchers, and getting through a whole lot of reforms in the country. And he was also deputy head of the planning, de facto head of the planning commission in Pakistan at one stage, and so he's back in Pakistan. So this has been good. That and his own institute has been running a series of webinars on how COVID-19 is impacting. Dr. Salim Jahan is Director, UNDP Human Development Report Office for many years now. And earlier he was a professor of economics at Dhaka University. And actually we thought Salim was going to be in Dhaka, but is actually in a totally different time zone and has got up at well before dawn to participate. Thank you very much, Salim. And Dr. Sanim Bagle is chairman of the IIDS in Kathmandu. And again, you know, they cross this disciplinary, not so much disciplinary, but academic research and public policy background. So it's very, very well qualified to talk on the situation, both from an analytical researcher point of view, but also from the governance issues and the more general socio-political issues. And Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, he's the executive director of the Lakshman Kadirgama Institute. And before that, he also had a varied career. Most recently, before he came back to Sri Lanka, he was with the ADB for many years and was Dean of Research in the ADB Institute in Tokyo, but also was based in Manila. And before that, held positions in various positions in the US, UK, and again, a combination of academic and public policy person. And so we have an absolutely excellent panel who can both interact with each other and with the audience. And so I invite now Dr. Nadeem to start off. Each speaker will speak for 10 to 12 minutes, and we'll move on to the others so that all the questions and answers will start only after all the panelists have had their initial say. But you can send your question through the chat function, which will be collated, and at the end of the panelists' presentations, they can respond during Q&A. Thanks. Nadeem, you.
Thank you, Zisra. Thank you. Thank you very much for arranging this. Thank you very much for arranging this webinar. I think it's very timely, very interesting, and I think South Asians can only, unfortunately, talk to each other through Australia. I wish there was more interaction plus our own selves, but we can't. So anyways, look, Zisra, just to be short, the virus has obviously created panic around the world. It's not just in Pakistan, it's everywhere, as you said. And certainly, despite the hyperactivity amongst the academics, there still remains a huge degree of uncertainty on the virus. Epidemiologists still have not been able to confirm for us where the virus is headed, where the peak is, and what we should expect. So we are just winging it, although there's a lot of chatter on the net and there's a lot of paper being published, but we are winging it. And we have no idea what this is. And in a sense, if one thinks about it, it's like a kind of a herd behavior that we see on stock markets. We've got into total panic. And there's a Swedish researcher who keeps saying, hey guys, don't panic. Sweden has figured it out. And I think there's something to be said for that, and we should think about it. But in any case, what we've seen so far is, yes, the US has 100,000 deaths, but in Pakistan and India that I've seen, there are very few deaths. And even the rates of infection are fairly low. Pakistan has about 50,000 infections so far out of 50 or 60,000 out of a population of about 220 million. That's not very large. But nevertheless, it has had deep impacts. As you know, the global trade is shut down. Pakistan is in a state of lockdown, was in a state of lockdown, but it was a confused lockdown because we went into a lockdown kind of partially. Government was not fully convinced. People did not fully follow. The government did not fully enforce. Now we had to give up the lockdown because of The Prime Minister felt that it was imposing a harsh burden on the poor. So we've kind of given up the lockdown, but there is a threat that was made by the health advisor only a few days ago that we could possibly have a renewal of the lockdown. After the lockdown, the cases of infection have gone up from, I think, about 400 to almost 2,000, but that's still not too large because that still means the doubling of the virus would be roughly about 20, 25 days. So I still have to see. And we've done some models ourselves, all kinds of models to see where it'll peak. And it's very hard to figure it out. The lockdown has been controversial, as you said. As I said, it's been very controversial. We've talked about it, we've vacillated on it. Many other researchers have also vacillated on it. So we don't know whether lockdown is a good policy or not. Social distancing is very hard to enforce in a country like ours. Now, let me tell you basically, very briefly, what we expect. We've already, the government has kind of given us an initial figure for growth rate this year. We were growing at about 2% per annum before the virus. Now, this quarter, we probably had a negative almost 10% or something because the whole year growth has come down to negative 0.5. We had estimated it would be anywhere between 0.5 and 1.6. Now, the figures in Pakistan, as you know, and figures in most developing countries, even in the advanced countries, tend to be very shaky. They're revised frequently. Last year's growth figure was revised sharply. So we don't know what the impact, but definitely for the first time in its history, Pakistan is seeing negative growth. This growth is widespread. Agriculture, I think we might be safe because agriculture, the crop sector is really not that affected. It's much more climatically determined and there's much less need for social distancing there. I mean, the COVID is really an urban phenomenon. So agriculture is not that badly affected from what we can see. Manufacturing certainly has been affected because they had to be locked down for about a month and a half. Even now, they're not operating at full capacity. At the same time, export orders have collapsed. So manufacturing has been severely affected. Exports have sharply declined, but so have imports. But then there is a silver lining in every cloud. Oil imports have fallen and that has helped us. And so that's a huge issue that we see. We've also got, the biggest sector that has been impacted is the services sector. The daily labor, the informal sector, they're wiped out. And the small and medium industry, the restaurant sector, those sectors have been wiped out and they are really suffering. And we've calculated all kinds of things. For example, poverty we expect will go up by about almost double if this continues for a long time. Even today, we think poverty has gone up by about 20 or 30%. The small-scale industries, we worked out all kinds of mechanisms on how they should be helped in the small-scale industry as well as the poor. And the estimates that we came up with were close to about 500 billion rupees a month, which is not a small sum of money for Pakistan, which is almost like 1.5% of GDP. But remember, Pakistan is going through a fund program even before the COVID. Pakistan is a chronic fund user. We've been going through a IMF program since last year. And that IMF program has already got us into a deep, as you know, we've got a shortfall in reserves, a huge current account deficit. Because of the IMF program, we had to crunch on our growth. So growth rate was already coming down. Our fiscal deficit was programmed to decline. But now all of a sudden, our fiscal deficit is ballooned, and we are talking about probably a 9 or 10% fiscal deficit, whereas it was programmed to be about 5%. So yes, it's been a huge impact on the program. I don't know how the program will go. So far, the IMF has given us emergency funding, but the program has to be renegotiated and thought through, and I think it's going to happen sometime during the summer. No, in fact, even as we speak, because the budget is due on the beginning of June. So yes, the program has to be negotiated before the budget. So these are basically crudely the things that I have. But let me put it this way. From whatever I've learned from public health specialists, and we've been talking to public health specialists on a daily basis. On a daily basis, we've been talking to public health specialists. The public health specialists are telling us that the COVID virus is deadly to older people and people with comorbidities, means people who have an underlying disease. So COVID does not affect the younger boy. This is what the Swedish authorities have been saying too, and their public health specialists said, look, the vulnerable should protect themselves. The rest of the population can go as normal because it doesn't affect them. So the issue is, I want you to focus on the term comorbidity, that it's the comorbidity that is the problem and not the ordinary population. But I want to take it in the economic direction. We are the region of comorbidity. This region has never solved its problems. So I would argue, let us not blame the COVID for our problems. This region has been very slow on reform. This region has put politics first. This region is still stuck in the 19th century nationalism and probably 15th century religious fanaticism. So we are the region that trades the least, that is least integrated, that is willing to talk the least. As I said, Cecily, we need you to coordinate us. So I think we need to worry about our comorbidity. We can blame COVID for a lot, but we can't blame COVID for the fact that we are still one of the slowest growing regions in the world. Yes, India sparked for a while, but you can see that also is kind of sputtering. So the comorbidity has to be focused on, that we people are not really capable of doing the structural reform and getting our policy right to really be able to tackle the problems of the 21st century. And the COVID will reveal our comorbidities, and I hope, force us to engage in the reform necessary to get in the 21st century. But history of the last 70 years does not convince me that we will change. I think the biggest problem South Asia needs to focus on is not COVID so much as why is it that we are incapable of developing economies for the 21st century. And very quickly, one of the things that we've seen in the lockdown everywhere in South Asia, that one of the reasons we can't impose the lockdown, we can't do what the rest of the world has done, because we lack the systems to be able to do that. When we enforce a lockdown, people start walking, people start biking, people start doing all kinds of things, because we never arranged for them to live properly, we never arranged for them to migrate properly. We treated them as casual labor in the cities. At the same time, our cities, and we'll do that next time, our cities are not arranged for the poor. So definitely the COVID will, work like a box of matches in these cities, because they're just not configured for ordinary living. So I think, quite frankly, while we are talking about COVID, and we are really lamenting COVID, we should also focus on the fact that we as a people are not ready to undertake the reform necessary to come to the 21st century, and our economies are really not sitting in the 21st century. So I was looking at some bonds yesterday. Our bonds are interestingly priced, and that's something we should also think about. So I think I'll just leave it at that. Yes, Pakistan has a lot of problems, and we have to deal with them, but our problems are half, I would say only 20% COVID related. Our problems are deeper structural problems that we are just not ready to face. And those problems, I hope COVID will expose. Thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Nadim. That's that's a great overview of what has happened in Pakistan, and I suspect that what you just described in Pakistan does resonate throughout the region. But let's get to that as the speakers go through. I'll ask Salim to talk about Bangladesh, and I'm sure you can take off from where Nadim left.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I think let me start with three initial observations very quickly. First, this is a global phenomena. We haven't seen it earlier, this kind of phenomena. More than 212 countries and territories have been affected by it. So it's a global nature. Second, the intensity and the power with which it is affecting the lives of people and the economies is unprecedented. Let's also recognize that. And third, this particular coronavirus or COVID-19 has pushed us back into our own homes or has locked us down, and that has also ramifications. So in that particular context, if we talk about the COVID-19 situation, the challenges, what can be done in the context of Bangladesh, there are two aspects of it. One is, of course, the health aspect, public health aspect, and how we deal with COVID-19 in terms of infection, in terms of death, how we deal with it from a medical point of view, from a public health point of view. We know that the whole question of social distancing is not possible in a country like Bangladesh because of its population density, because of its custom. The issue of the lockdown is also sometimes becomes moot because people who are poor, who are marginalized, will have to get out of their homes to earn a living, to work, and so that kind of thing. So I will not focus so much on the whole question of the public health issue. There are lots of work going on in terms of mapping of the COVID infection, the kind of the death. The testing is going on about 10,000 people a day, which is quite nominal. But on the public health issue, there are people and experts who can talk about those things more. I'll rather focus on the socioeconomic aspect of the challenges and what can be done. I think one of the issues that is being discussed and hotly debated in the context of Bangladesh is whether to save lives or whether to save the economy. In my view, this is actually an unproductive discussion. And I think this is a false dichotomy also. We have to save lives and also we have to save the economy. The question is how we phase it, how we approach it, how we integrate those kind of things. So in that context, let me talk about the immediate run, the short run, and in the long run. And I'll try to combine the challenges and what is being done in those three aspects or three dimensions. I think right now, the challenge for the Bangladesh economy is basically how to deal with people who are poor and marginalized. We are talking of lockdown, we are talking of staying at home, but for people who work in traditional sectors, people who work in informal sectors, people who will have to go out every day to earn a living, for them, this whole question of lockdown doesn't work. So what can be done about it? I think at this point in time, people who are poor and marginalized need two things. One is they have to be ensured about their food security. And second, they want or they need kind of cash to deal with other expenditures. And in this country of Bangladesh, things are not so simple. But both the government and the civil societies are trying to deal with those issues. There have been programs, and government is very much aware that the food security is an issue for people who are marginalized and poor. And since the economy is under lockdown, so therefore there have been programs to provide with basic needs in terms of rice, in terms of lentils, and all kinds of things. And government has also started a program to provide the kind of cash through banks. Now, the problem is how to get these things to people who need them most. First of all, in many cases, it's not very well known where the mapping of where the need is. In many cases, the structure is not there. Of course, we have systems like bKash, but that's coverage is very small. bKash is like M-Pesa in Kenya. So that's one of the challenges right now, to provide food security and also to provide income or cash to poor people. And I must say that the NGOs are doing a great job, smaller NGOs, local NGOs, as well as big NGOs, in carrying out this particular task. But still, it is a formidable challenge. Now, when we move from the immediate run to the short run, I think one of the challenges the whole economy is facing is that how to open it up. There are questions of open up. There are issues that are being discussed at how best to open up. And I think the issue here is not to open the whole economy all at once, but rather to do in phases. Now, then the question is how we phase it. Which are the sectors which we open up first, and which are the sectors or the activities which we open up later on. I think it is very important to open up the sectors where most of the marginalized and poor people work. It may be the informal sector. It may be the traditional sector that we talk about. In this particular context, I must emphasize agriculture, because a lot of people are there. I think agriculture is also a sector where it may be easier to keep the social distancing that we talk about. Agriculture is also important because of food shortages down the road. So that's very much important. The second issue that we have to deal in the short run is that basically when we are locked down, and we are locked up actually within our households, there are incidents of domestic violence that is coming up. Women have to carry most of the burdens of housework, and since people are cooped in a house or in rooms, there are tensions, and as a result of that, there are violences. And the violences are not always physical. It can be mental, it can be psychological. And some of those mental issues would be a problem down the road, particularly with children. And I know that this issue is not coming up that much in the discussion in Bangladesh, but lots of the people who work in that area are flagging the importance of it. We will have to think about how to send children to school, because by June, schools will also be open, and how we deal with that particular issue in the short run. And the final point in the short run would be that the economy would be affected, both in terms of growth, in terms of exports. I mean, the two driving forces of the good growth in Bangladesh has been the garments industry as well as the remittances. And the projection is that about 2 million workers, and particularly women who work in the garment industries, would be affected down the road. So that would have definitely economic implications, but also social implications. Secondly, we don't know what's going to happen to remittances, because as the Middle Eastern economy faces problems, there may be issues with foreign workers, and those workers may be sent back to Bangladesh. And how to absorb them in the economy would be a greater challenge for the government as we move forward. Finally, I mean, one of the things that I must talk about is in the long run. For the time being, for this year, we have good production of agricultural products, of staples. There are good stocks by the government. So if there is a shortage of food this year, we can manage it, I think. But if any of these seasons, plantation seasons down the road, is missed, if the farmers don't have the fertilizers, the irrigation, the seeds down the road, there may be a food shortage, for example, next year. And that would have severe implications, not only in terms of the economy, but also in terms of human development, in terms of food availability, nutrition, and all kinds of things. So I think the government is aware of it, and lots of people are raising this issue, because that food shortage may be global in nature. And if that happens, then it would be very difficult for countries like Bangladesh to depend on others. I think these are the challenges, and definitely the government is trying to deal with those challenges. One of the issues that they will have to deal with those things is the coming budget, which would be presented in June, which is next month. And people are awaiting as to what sort of budget that would be, and whether there are new thinking or fresh approaches to prepare the budget. The Bangladesh is also trying to launch its 8th five-year plan sometime in September or October. And there are debates within the country whether we have to rethink about the planning, because COVID-19 is going to stay with us for quite some time. The reality which we used to know is not going to be there any longer. And there will be a new reality, not only in terms of how we live, but also in terms of how we run the economy and how we deal with those issues. So I'll stop at this particular point, and then we'll try to get back if there are questions or if there are observations and comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Salim. Yeah, in order to conserve time, I will go immediately to Swarnim, who will talk about Nepal, but of course there'll be overlapping issues that are there. Just on the food security issue, I also want to take this opportunity just to flag that we have a webinar coming soon, specifically focused on food security, and I hope you'll be able to participate in that too. Yes, Swarnim.
Okay. Thank you, Sisira, for putting together this panel, and great to see so many friends. And I'm also happy to note there's a very heavy and a healthy turnout from Nepal. So good to see many friends and familiar faces. I think Nepal is also mimics some of the other South Asian stories that we've heard. The human toll in itself has been fairly limited. 4 months ago, we had 1 case. 2 months ago, around March 23rd, we had 2 cases. But as of yesterday, I think we've now crossed 900 cases and about 5 deaths. So that's a function of course, scaled up testing, as well as some of the migratory phenomenon that we've seen. We have a very large porous border with India, and despite the controls, I think there's some infiltration there. The large international influences, the channels through which the impacts are felt in Nepal are really through 3 avenues, right? The one is remittances, the second is tourism, and the third is trade. But once those impacts enter Nepal, I think the impact really propagate through the large impact they have on our services industry, which accounts to almost 60%, 58-59% of the GDP. The industrial component is about 16%, of which manufacturing is 5%, and mining is about 0.5 percentage points. Agriculture was kind of shielded because a lot of the harvest times and all that have passed in the current fiscal year. But there are a lot of delicate industries, the dairy industry, the poultry industry, the vegetables, for example. Those have been impacted more directly after the onset of the lockdown. So the Central Bureau of Statistics recently estimated that Nepal's growth will contract, of course, from 8.5%, which was the very optimistic projection exactly a year ago. Even before COVID, that was unlikely. Through our institute, we had projected that it would come down to around 6%. But COVID and the lockdowns have really had a direct hit on that. So the projection now is only about 2.3%. But this was under the assumption that many activities would begin to resume end of May and mid-June, and until going up to mid-July when the current fiscal year ends. So that is obviously unlikely now. So it's very, very clear that growth will be between 0 and 1%. If not, it will head towards a negative sort of a territory. And from that perspective, even from a macroeconomic accounting perspective, so this is a situation that is possibly going to be worse than what we saw in the 2015-2016 period, when we faced this massive earthquake, and that was immediately followed by the blockade on the Indo-Nepal border, and going earlier, maybe 2001, 2002, when we also had a very negative sort of a growth episode in the aftermath of the Royal Massacre, and very, very troublesome domestic difficulties with the civil war peaking and all that. So, so this is the sort of a larger growth story. Within the the constituents of the GDP, I think wholesale and retail trade has taken a big hit. Hotels and restaurants are practically shut. Transport is practically shut. Manufacturing and mining are obviously operating at a very low capacity. Construction is almost closed. So this is how I think the combination of a supply shock, demand shock, and a financial shock. So, as global commentators have pointed out, in the past instances, we used to have either one of the three. Now this is a triple whammy where the supply, demand, and the financial shock have really been intertwined and are causing havoc, not just incomes and jobs, but people's livelihoods. Let me briefly talk about the specific channels. I think tourism, it was supposed to be a very exciting year for Nepal. Visit Nepal year 2020 had been announced. We expected 2 million tourists to stay on average for 15 days, spend at least $75 a day. So we're looking at a sort of tourism pie of around $2 billion, which would have been almost a threefold increase on the roughly $700 million that we earn in terms of foreign exchange from tourism. Our projections done through my institute, IIDS, is that this fiscal year, we're not going to see more than $250 million. So this is a constriction by a factor of almost 10 from the most optimistic scenario to what the reality is going to look like. But more than that, I think 5% of our employment is absorbed by the tourism industry, 4% of GDP. So these things it's going to take a while. The UN, WTO, the World Tourism Organization already has predicted a very sharp decline globally of up to 30%, 50 million job losses and all that. So Nepal, being a fairly tourism dependent country, or to one or a sector which Nepal counts on to be a durable source of prosperity going forward, I think there's a lot of question marks raised on the nature, the character of tourism evolving even in the post COVID era. Maybe after the autumn, tourism from China and India will revive. That is one of the more optimistic scenarios, but it's really unpredictable at this point. Some avenues that we've seen in Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, talking about a trans-Tasman bubble, where countries that are fairly secure start resuming tourism along specific corridors. We've seen this in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. But I'm following the trans-Tasman bubble quite carefully, because in the second phase they might open it up to South Korea or China. And this is it might be very difficult for Nepal, which is India locked on 3 sides with a very porous border. But on the air links, possibly those kind of corridors could be opened once it can be verified that these things are fairly safe. Remittances is the big story, big elephant in the room, of course. For a populous country with almost 30 million people, I think the size of remittances relative to the size of the economy is the highest in the world at about 27%. Roughly $8 billion of officially recorded remittances come in that have helped reduce poverty, that have helped make rural lives less vulnerable. The imports that the remittances fuel, the taxes on which have been a very secure buffer for public finances. And we've been able to, the foreign exchange reserves have been reasonably healthy, supporting almost 8 to 9 months of imports. All that will be under attack as remittance flows start to dwindle, and the migrant returnees will start to come back, conditional on many of the host countries going into sharp recessions themselves, right? So Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Malaysia, and Qatar, they host the largest chunk of Nepali temporary migrants. So depending on what happens in those economies, the severity of migrant returnees and the challenge that poses, not just for economic opportunities within Nepal, job creation and all that, but possibly social and political ramifications as well. So that's something that we're watching very carefully. On trade, merchandise exports was already stagnant for a variety of reasons, but a lot of the supply chains, the import channels have also been disrupted. The informal sector is where, as we heard from Bangladesh and Pakistan, a lot of the humanitarian crises are evolving. According to our labor force survey and the National Economic Census, roughly we have 7 million people engaged in many of these activities, 4.4 million of which are in the informal sector. 2.9 million are in the non-farm informal sector. All of that has been badly hit. The other side of the ledger is there have roughly been more than 900,000 medium and small enterprises, almost half of them, half of which are unregistered and almost informal. So they have really gone into a lot of trouble. I don't want to bore you with the details, but IIDS has done a very recent study on this, squaring both the macro numbers on tourism and remittances with a very detailed survey that we did, a quick survey that we did even in a period of lockdown, asking 700 firms and almost 400 people, fairly representative along the ecological belts and along all of Nepal's 7 provinces, including Kathmandu Valley, of course. So the picture that is coming up is very grim. And many have gone back to the villages, gone back to the refuse of the rural sort of subsistence economy to survive, basically. We're now in our 3rd month of lockdown, and as has been pointed out, the strain on livelihoods, job losses is very severe. I may go into the numbers if some questions come, but let me put it there. So, coping mechanisms have been quite diverse, and the needs that many of these hard-hit sectors expect of the government are vary from interest subsidies to cash handouts to waivers, tax moratoria, rental moratoria, some relief on utility payments and all that. But it varies by sector and by region and all that. So this brings me to the response. So today, May 28th, is actually the budget day. So in a few hours, we'll hear the finance minister announce this year's sort of the budget package. He has been criticized for having come up with a very lukewarm kind of a package. And when we confronted him with the modest size of what he had offered a few weeks ago, he kept on saying, well, you can't really compare ourselves with India or the United States or the United Kingdom, where people talk about 10% of GDP and all that. He says, what about our own tax wherewithal? It's not, we're a poor country, low income country, there are limited resources. A lot of the responses had been transferred to other entities. And so I think we await with some optimism whether he would be able to take on this challenge of an economic package head on today. There's a lot of issue about the bloated size of the government. So some austerity measures are also needed. A very brutal kind of a reallocation of resources from low priority areas to higher priority areas, and also how we handle borrowing. There's obviously going to be a big fiscal gap, and the revenue is going to shrink, especially associated with the fall in remittance inflows. On what terms, from which sources, and which sectoral allocations are we going to rely on this concessional finance? Mostly it's the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, considering that the grants are going to also dry up because many of the bilateral partners who we used to rely on for concessional grants are also facing economic problems themselves. The second issue is on the agenda of agriculture, employment generation, and the expansion of social protection. Is there going to be some innovation there? Or is it just going to be plain old distributionist kind of politics, handouts? And the third thing we're going to look for is there's going to be life after COVID too. So what are the seeds that he's going to plant on the new sources of economic growth? Already agriculture, this lukewarm, stagnant manufacturing, and a very fickle kind of a services industries was not going to take us very far. So we're already debating about the new sources, the more dynamic sources of economic growth, job creating, but also really resting on Nepal's true comparative advantage. Are there going to be these plantations that we're going to see embedded in terms of the policy responses in this year's budget? So are we going to see a concrete response to SMEs? Are we going to see a big nudge on the agenda of digitalization? And also, are we going to anticipate and really prepare for some of the coming disruptions in tourism, even on FDI? The nature of global value chains will possibly also change. So today, coincidentally, is going to be a big day for us. So I think I've exhausted my time, and I'll stop here.
Thanks, Anim. Well, obviously, a lot of people in Nepal and also outside will be looking at what is happening with the budget. But the problems, I think, starting with Nadeem, what he has outlined for Pakistan seemed to come true. Bangladesh, Nepal, and I'll ask Ganeshan to give us the picture in Sri Lanka. Ganesh.
Thank you very much, Sisira, for having me here, and to Monash. It's a pleasure to see lots of old friends and also Sri Lankans. I'm going to try to make 4 broad points. Let me just mention them, and then I'll just mention them in some detail. The first point is that Sri Lanka has managed the COVID health response fairly well to date compared to the rest of the region. The second general point I want to mention is that the economy will take a hit, but there is some restructuring that's beginning to show and leads to some optimism about the future. The third point I want to mention is that the government has acted fairly decisively on the economic policy response, and some sort of useful start is there. But clearly, we need to have a refined strategy, in order to move forward to kind of create some momentum for growth in the period ahead. So let me just elaborate a little bit on those few points. In terms of the health response, we've had some 1,469 cases to date of COVID. Now, if you take that on a per million population basis, that's some 52 cases per million population in Sri Lanka, compared to several hundred in the rest of South Asia. And our mortality rate has been very low. I think our mortality rate in terms of deaths per cases is some under 1%. And half of these cases in total out of these 1,400 are really in the Navy. There were some issues of contact tracing where people went out and I think they got infected. So the civilian transmission is very low, and most of this is imported cases so far. Now why is this? So part of this is that the general immunity levels of the population of Sri Lanka have been quite good, linked to upper middle income status and free food over years. So nutrition levels are fairly high. Second, we have quite a good universal healthcare system in Sri Lanka. And I think there are some 40 odd quarantine centers that have been built by a combination and operated by the combination of the health ministry and also the military, who are tasked with disaster response, and they have naturally spilled over into this area. Contact tracing has been fairly good from what we understand. And we are a small economy, which means it's kind of easier to do a lot of this. But obviously, there's caution to all of this, as the lockdown is easing, particularly this week. In terms of challenges that Cicero brought up, I mean, we have to test a lot more. We've had some 59,000 PCR tests to date, which is far below the 2 to 4% of population, which is what is being talked about in developed countries. And we also need a better communication strategy for the lockdowns and curfews and so on. And I mean, this has been a general issue across the country, and across history and policy regimes in Sri Lanka. We don't communicate policy very well over time. So those are issues on the health and the communications and the lockdowns. In terms of the economy, so the growth numbers vary a lot between commentators. The central bank is expecting a plus 1.5% growth this year. The IMF in its WIO released a few weeks ago was talking about minus 0.5%. And there are various private commentators and others who take a view. If you take a poll of the numbers, the number is something like, 1% on average at most that you may get for 2020. And this is, quite a bit less than the 2.3% that Sri Lanka got last year, which was a fairly low number. And 2021 is likely to be a flat sort of growth position, the way I see it, kind of an L-shaped story with sluggish performance. In terms of the major sectors, exports have gone down 42% year on year, and FDI to April was some $370 million the first quarter. This is far less than the fairly lowish figures of about $1 billion, $1.5 billion that we get every year. and much of that going into infrastructure. Business investment is depressed and confidence is low. There have been capital outflows. And obviously there are some risks to poverty and unemployment. And of course, there are various risks that are there on the horizon for the outlook. So one risk is the lack of fiscal space. We kind of have a debt overhang, and we have twin deficits on the fiscal side and also on the balance of payments. And that has constrained our ability to act. A second risk is the pressure that this crisis puts on the banking system. And there are maybe secondary risks which are there in the future. And then we have the international risk, of course. We're a small export-oriented economy. And, weak demand externally is an issue for us from our major markets in the US and Europe, but also in Asia. And there's rising protectionism. Now, against that background, there are new signs of activity that are emerging and some interesting things. Interestingly, tea is booming because people are drinking lots of tea in lockdown circumstances globally, which is good for Sri Lanka. And agri-food is also in demand, again, for the same sort of reason, people need to eat. And then there's been an interesting switching in the garment sector to some extent, where garment firms and chemical firms and rubber are moving to PPE equipment, masks and gloves and things like that, partly natural resource-based story, plus, capability story and textiles that Sri Lanka has. The United States, for instance, is very dependent on PPE equipment from China, as I understand, and they're, trying to move away from that. So they have some 8 or 9 of our largest garment firms that are, by the way, also in Bangladesh and in other places that are trying to switch into PPE. Masks, for instance, are there, and also rubber gloves. But of course, there's a 6-month FDA approval process that that companies have to go through. Another big opportunity for Sri Lanka is that FDI is leaving China and moving to other regions, and the recent crackdown in Hong Kong is suggesting that even financial services might be looking to move. So Sri Lanka has these two interesting areas to exploit. The Hambantota port in southern Sri Lanka and the industrial zone could be some recipient of some manufacturing FDI as it moves out of China in specific sort of areas. And then the Colombo port city that's coming up, which is some 260 odd hectares of reclaimed land that's right on the cusp of our industrial sort of central business district, could eventually be some sort of services hub for Sri Lanka, which is obviously shifting more and more into services over time. Domestic tourism is another opportunity that is there to be exploited. And then international tourism under some sort of controlled conditions, perhaps along corridors with China, for instance, are being explored, and then with particular Indian states that have got the COVID issue under control. The third point I want to make is really about the economic response. The fiscal stimulus part has been muted in Sri Lanka. Probably all the measures taken amount to less than 1% of GDP so far because of our debt overhang and our fiscal room, which is problematic. And that compares with some 10% that India announced a few days ago. And I think Bangladesh has some 5-6% of GDP stimulus they're talking about, and so on. So a lot of our stimulus has been on the monetary policy side and on the financial sector story. We've cut interest rates by 100 basis points in March, and there is further pressure on banks to on-lend quicker to customers at lower rates of interest. So the pass-through should be there much quicker. And there are various types of assistance being provided to sectors. And there are also, there's an attempt to get companies to keep people in employment but pay reduced wages. The labor minister has been very active in brokering a successful tripartite negotiation with unions and firms out to, I think it's to May, June, and 50% wages are there so that people don't get fired in large numbers from the formal sector. And some of the export-oriented firms have restarted. I think some 30-40% have restarted under controlled conditions. The fourth point I want to make is Sri Lanka obviously needs to adjust economically in the future to become much more flexible and agile in this post-COVID world that we will see. And for that, we need to have a refined economic strategy. And that strategy really has 4 key prongs to it. The first is we've got to mitigate the hardships of the people through food security and modernization of agriculture. We're going to have to do some sort of a big push into ag so that we ensure food security for the population and reduce concomitantly imports on food, basic food. We're talking about, there are lots of problems. Post-harvest losses are large. Agricultural productivity is very low. The size of hand loading is insufficient. Cicero is one of the leading experts on ag, so I don't need to talk a lot about that. Cicero will, I'm sure, tell us about that. Then there is the second leg, which is macro stabilization. We have a fairly high debt to GDP ratio, and the government is in talks with the IMF on RF, rapid credit facility. Up to, I guess, 100% of our quota would be wonderful. And also, eventually we'll need another fund program, an enhanced fund program. Presumably that will happen after the elections. We're also talking to the RBI on a bilateral swap arrangement. $400 million is there, and they're trying to talk about more. And the PBOC also have said that they will provide us with assistance. So stabilization becomes very important. Also to pay for the social protection that is needed. We provide a small amount for people on a monthly basis, and we're trying to provide more. And then the third point of that is to improve the investment climate for Sri Lanka. And that involves digitization of all government services on a rapid basis. And that's begun to happen through customs and also through immigration and other areas. Visas and other business permits of all kinds. That should really extend much further. And government has talking about digital ID card to make things much easier for this to happen. And that will also reduce rent-seeking behavior, undoubtedly, which is a big spin-off, as well as efficiency. And then there is also talk about speeding up other types of important reforms which are needed, particularly in setting up and starting business. And the fourth important point of that is policy coordination. That's essential. Now, some of these things we talked about in a report that we did. My institute supported the Pathfinder Foundation to come out with a report called A New Economic Vision for a Post-COVID Sri Lanka. It's on the LKI website. If anyone is interested, we have a very detailed policy matrix on what it would take Sri Lanka to go forward in the medium term along these four priorities. So just to conclude, in the final analysis, this is a crisis like no other for Sri Lanka. But I am, cautiously optimistic that with a refined strategy, Sri Lanka has a pathway to turn crisis into opportunity. And if we do the right things now, I think, we can come out of this and gradually set the momentum for some kind of post-COVID new normal growth. Thank you very much, Cecil.
Thanks, Anesh, and thanks to all for panelists for keeping to time. I will now hand over to my colleague Gaurav Dutt. Gaurav would have been collating questions and so on. But just before I do that, I want to just raise a couple of points that both the panelists and the audience members might want to think about. One is about the extent of the spread of the virus in South Asia. I keep reading stories that, on top of the fact that we don't test that much, so there's under-testing, that even in developed countries, certainly so in the US, but elsewhere too, that if we look at the excess deaths, lots of excess deaths compared to the normal, which have been attributed to diseases like pneumonia, which have similar symptoms, the numbers which may be attributed to COVID go up significantly. The second is all these countries have had lockdowns, but the scope and the effectiveness of those lockdowns seems to have varied quite a bit. I think Nadeem started talking about Pakistan situation where it was, what I would call, what he called and what I agree with, very shaky, there was the issue of commitment, how effectively was it implemented, and so on. So, you know, where does that go, and what should be done to confront the challenges now? That's a big issue, I suppose. Yeah, over to you, Gaurav.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Sisera, and my thanks also to all the speakers for their presentations and also staying pretty much within the time limit. So actually, you know, as it turns out, I mean, they were at the high point, and there still are about 164 participants. So we have had a huge flurry of questions. So it'll probably won't be, just to, before I get into passing on some of the questions, it probably won't be possible for us to get through all of them, and I'll try to group them together. And therefore, my request to some of the participants would be that if they would like, they should send their questions directly through email to individual speakers if they are not covered right now. So so with that, let me first turn to at least a couple of questions which are more directed to specific individuals, and in particular, beginning with Nadeem. So Nadeem, there's one question on your view of the impact of COVID-19 in rural areas, especially as with the lockdown, people going back to rural areas, that process accelerates. Is there a danger of the spread of the virus in rural areas, and what you think about it? Because you talked about the agriculture sector so far being relatively less affected. So there was this question which was especially directed for you. Maybe we can begin with that.
I think Nadeem may have,
Yes.
because he had to, his unexpected commitment that he had to leave at his time 11, which is like now.
He's not there anymore.
Yes, unfortunately, yes.
Okay, so then let me move on to some of the other questions. So there's quite a number of questions which deal with the issue of remittances one way or another, which clearly, as many speakers pointed out, is quite important for most of the countries in the South Asia region. And most of the questions really, firstly, point out the difficulties that the speakers have also talked about, but then they go on to ask really, what do the speakers think in terms of how to deal with the challenges posed by, presented by the decline in remittances and the lack of that employment opportunity? Is there scope for regional cooperation here that should be thought about? But more generally, really, what should be the response to deal with the challenges posed by the decline in remittances? So I don't know if Salim or anyone, Swarnim, you would want to take that on.
I can take it on. I think with regard to remittances, there are two issues there. One is the loss of foreign exchange. The other one are the people themselves. I mean, what to do with them. Now, in terms of the fall in foreign exchanges, I think that's real. If there are economic slowing down in the Middle East, for example, where most of the Bangladeshi workers work, then there will be a decline in the remittances. And then the government will have to think about how to generate that kind of resources that would be needed. This is a big challenge. I don't think we have a very concrete answer right now. We are pretending that we have the solution, but let us be very honest about it. We don't even know the extent of the problem. So therefore, at this particular stage, I don't think we can think about how to overcome the shortages of remittances for a country like Bangladesh. Now, the second issue, which is more human issue, is that with the decline in oil prices and the economic slowing down in a number of labor receiving countries, there will be a time when these people will be sent back. And when they are sent back, there will be two issues there. One is whether they are carriers of COVID-19, because that process, that phase will continue. So there has to be a testing, there has to be a kind of an approach to find out whether these people are the carriers of that virus. But more importantly, when they come back, how to absorb them in the economy. And I think at that juncture, if we think that we can have policies at that juncture, that would be too late. So we have to think it early on right now. One way that most of these workers who have been working there would come back with some kind of skill. They are unskilled workers, no doubt about it, but they are having some skills while they're working there. When they come back, there may be some sectors where they can be absorbed. One is lots of the Bangladeshi workers are working there as technicians, are working there as construction workers. So the informal technology sector, which has been thriving in the 80s in a country like Bangladesh, may be a place where some of those people can be absorbed. Bangladesh also trying to reach out to the outside world to get some of the work related to publishing, printing, and whether we can also use some of those workers in that particular sector. Agriculture would be a big sector where these people can be absorbed, but it's not agriculture per se, but the food processing industries is another place that we have to explore. I think this is something that the next 5-year plan will have to explore, and I strongly feel that we are at the very end or a very final stage of that plan preparation, but maybe there has to be some rethinking given the situation that we are in, that whether we can look at the objectives of that particular plan, the instruments of that particular plan, and as well as the resource allocation of that particular plan. And as I have said, that this is the time when we have to explore and see how we can overcome the problem of foreign exchanges, but at the same time can actually absorb some of the returning migrant workers to Bangladesh.
So, Nemi, did you want to?
Yeah. Can I jump in on this? So the situation, I think, in Nepal is similar to that of Bangladesh, but possibly more severe. At least Bangladesh, you have other quite vibrant industries. So garment industry, especially in the way they have employed them in large numbers, and that is missing in Nepal, right? So remittance and the foreign employment was really that one big outlet of all the young people who came into the labor force. Now, our early preliminary predictions are that, this year, again, contingent on a set of assumptions, remittance inflows, which used to average around $7-8 billion per year, officially recorded minimum, will probably contract by between 14%, that was a very conservative estimate by the World Bank, to up to 40%, 40, which was based on an assessment that we pulled together from lots of remittance receiving or processing companies in Nepal, right? So this is a serious issue for us. Poverty, vulnerability, import taxation, and a lot of the other dynamism that we saw in our services industries, I think that's all going to be hit. And of course, foreign exchange buffer that will rapidly dwindle and all that. It was anticipated, it was always recognized that as remittance became very prominent over the last 10 years, which is a combination of both the push factor, instability and lack of decent jobs within the country, and the pull factor, which was this growing commodity-based growth in the host countries. This was never a sustainable proposition. And it so happened that Nepal, as I mentioned earlier, for a populous country, the dependence on remittances is the largest in the world at 27%. You have the Moldovas and the Vanuatus and the small island states which rely a lot on remittances. But for a sizably populous country like Nepal, this is really so. The issue, public policy dilemma, was always how to win off such a heavy dependence on remittances over the next 10 years or so, and this also had to do something to do with our young demographic composition and all that. But that this crisis prepones that timeline to a very compressed calendar. We need to figure out a solution over the next 2 to 3 years if the whole landscape on foreign employment and all that will change. So immediate issues that are being talked about, again, this is something that we'll look into the budget as well today. Can agriculture be that big employer? But the irony there is many people escaped the traditional way in which we do subsistence agriculture. You engage in this 15-hour, 16-hour back-breaking work every day, and that's barely enough to survive. So people escaped from that drudgery in the first place. So whether it's migration to the urban towns or to foreign countries, it was to escape that kind of a low productive agriculture. So can we tweak that? Can we make it into agro-processing? What would it take to really revive agriculture and take it in a new direction? So that's the big issue. Construction, for a country that has really not been built, in terms of the infrastructure stock, I think there's a lot of potential there. But again, what numbers are we talking about? There's always the seasonal migration from the far west and the Midwest of Nepal. India used to absorb. So, what will happen to that story? The foreign employment in the Gulf and Malaysia and the Republic of Korea, that's a different dynamics. So it's going to be, a very, very, very big public policy challenge. One area was, of course, a lot of the highly skilled technical jobs in Nepal were actually taken up by lots of Indian migrants, right? The plumbers, the electricians, the construction workers, and many of our workers in Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates are engaged in the construction. So maybe there's some substitution that can be worked at. And having spoken to the employment minister, one of the issues that they're looking at is to take stock of the skill database, right? So either upon arrival or even before they leave these countries through the Nepali embassies abroad, one can take stock of what skills these migrants will bring, and that kind of a policy response can be engineered when they come. So let me just stop there.
Sorry, can I just add a comment? You raised the regional cooperation dimension, and I'd like to just add a couple of brief thoughts on that. This COVID crisis has prompted Prime Minister Modi to talk about an emergency fund for the SAARC, South Asian countries, and there was a teleconference between all the leaders of SAARC, I think in mid-March. Now that fund has got about $22 million, I think quite small. Sri Lanka contributed about 5 million, I think. But that may be the beginnings for a sort of a thaw in regional relations, one hopes. Of course, there are some issues around the size of the fund being limited and what kind of needs and how it would operate and what role the SAARC Secretariat has in such a fund. But, there's some sign of cooperation. I really think, to take one of Sisira's points that he mentioned about the crisis, I think the biggest form of cooperation would be as follows, that, an Indian consortium is working with an Oxford consortium on a vaccine. And I feel that, this should be accelerated and supported by all the countries, and a generic version of this vaccine be produced and made available to the rest of South Asia through Indian foreign aid, which exists to the other countries, but maybe not to Pakistan. And this would be one of the biggest ways of humanitarian assistance through this crisis be sort of put to good use through the countries. And because the problem with the current scenario is you have 100 initiatives trying to develop this vaccine worldwide, and many multinational companies naturally want to try to seek a rent by putting IP protection around the vaccine. And this would be a disaster for poorer countries, particularly those in South Asia. So I think, this is a very important avenue for regional cooperation. The second very important avenue is what's happening through a kind of a natural market-led process before the crisis in terms of regional cooperation. So before the crisis, COVID crisis came about, there was an outward shift of the garment industry, for instance, from Sri Lanka, which was higher cost, to Bangladesh. Many of our companies went and set up production centers in Bangladesh, and a large number of managers and skilled supervisors and quality controllers went to Bangladesh. Now, some of those are returning because of the downturn in the garment industry. But I imagine when growth picks up, we will see more of that type of transformation happening. And, I think we could reduce barriers to that kind of interaction. So there's some discussion of a Sri Lanka-Bangladesh trade agreement, for instance. to shore up confidence and allow a lot of the irritants, non-tariff measures that may be there to be taken off. So I just want to mention that because the regional dimension was brought up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, you know, what I might do is now actually list 3 or 4 questions in one go. And perhaps the speakers can pick and choose which ones they would want to respond to, just in the interest of time. So there is one set of questions on the financing of the crisis, you know, or perhaps the response to the crisis in particular. In fact, there's a question which asks about what should be the policy adopted by the Central Bank of Nepal or other financial institutions. There is also concerns and questions being raised about what can be the expectation regarding aid flows, bilateral or multilateral, from international financial institutions, what can be expected. So that's sort of one set of questions on the financing side. There are questions on related to the risks of opening up as the lockdown is relaxed in different countries. I mean, in some countries, obviously, even the initial enforcement has been compromised, but especially with the movement of people, you know, following the initial set of measures, the risks of spread and what the speakers think about the dangers of that and what kind of further issues that might raise. There's a question related, not related, in fact, a different question on that within this, even if it's more urban centered, the initial COVID impact, given that the cities are very densely populated, they have clusters of very dense populations, including slum dwellers and refugees, what kind of measures can be taken to protect these groups from the risks of COVID-19? There is a general question on what does this crisis mean in terms of, you know, arguments against globalization, liberalization, and privatization? Is there an argument for self-reliance now, and re-examination of the role of the state? So very broad level question. Are we back to Keynesian economics? And then there is, for instance, a specific question on Bangladesh that, you know, are there any alternatives to boost the small and medium enterprises other than through the banking system, which has its inefficiencies and it's perhaps riddled with corruption, and rather than relying through just the pass-through of the lower interest rate, are there other measures that could be taken? And then there's also some questions on what do the speakers think about the impact of the crisis on inequality and even feminization of poverty. So let me just stop here. There's a whole bunch of questions, and there's still some questions still coming in, which unfortunately I may not be able to, we may not be able to get to. But let me just pass that on to the speakers, and they could, you know, really pick and choose and see whichever ones they might want to engage with. Okay, thank you. Oh, actually, I might also add, there was also this question related to the regional cooperation one on the, you know, the hit to the tourism sector, whether there is a possibility of a SAARC tourism bubble along the lines of what is being talked about in Australia and New Zealand, you know, tourism bubble. Anyway, let's throw that in too. Okay, thanks. So, anyone wants to go first?
I'm happy to jump in very briefly. In terms of the debate about globalization and the role of the state, I think one thing, you know, the crisis shows up, at least in the case of Sri Lanka, really is the role of the state. I mean, you know, the state is very important as an actor in guaranteeing the response in an emergency situation. And part of our issue is that, of course, our cases were mostly imported, but a strong state response has helped, both in terms of the health response and having a universal healthcare system, as well as contact tracing and so on, which has been important, although testing is an issue. But also in terms of the state acting as an important harbinger of bringing together the bits that you can do to mitigate a crisis and begin to do some sort of stabilization, both in terms of impacts on the poor as well as other things. And I think that's very important. Of course, over time, you have to have then a shift back towards a much more business-friendly environment, so that the private sector can get on with the basis of, say, exporting, which is critical in the current story. So I think you need a strong state response. After all, and we may need a new social contract going forward, where we look at disaster risk management across South Asian countries, and there are protocols at the SARC level that are possible. And this health issue, I think, should be very much looked at the level of health, because it's a non-controversial issue. And one hopes that that SARC fund I mentioned will take a much more active role interpreting the disaster conventions that SARC has reached in order to have a much better health response. And India is central to this, because India, remember, is one of the few countries in the South Asian region that has a good generic drug industry and pharmaceutical industry that has this capability to produce low cost drugs and at good quality across the region. The other question I want to very briefly respond to is the central bank role, which I think is terribly important, and the financing issue. So in Sri Lanka, central bank is very active in trying to boost the money supply in many different ways, and that's obviously critical. We have a debt issue, and some of that is domestic, which has to be financed. Downward pressure on interest rates is another important thing, and making sure the pass-through happens to eventually SMEs and others, and also looking at ways in which other entities can on lend and provide various guarantees. So we are also moving towards guarantees. There's some discussion with the multilateral development banks, because the guarantee mechanism is very useful, because for $100 million worth of guarantees from a multilateral institutions, you may have on lending to 3 to 4, 500 million, right? That's the multiplier you can have, which is very important. So rather than having to get money that is then used in its entirety to support lending with the guarantee scheme, we may want to do that. And in the case of Sri Lanka, and I presume in Pakistan and in others, the IFI role is very important. And the IMF getting a package, emergency plus another enhanced structural adjustment facility is terribly important, because that would give investor confidence to deal with the debt situation that a country like Sri Lanka faces, but also allow domestic and other private lenders, because a lot of Sri Lanka's debt is carried by private markets, the confidence that this is taken care of to some extent with the stabilization. So let me just stop with those points. Thank you.
So Salim, you want to come in? Yeah, okay.
Yes, I think I'll take some of these questions there. One is this whole question of risks of opening up. Of course, there are risks, but at the same time, we know that we cannot close ourselves within the four walls of the houses, and the quote-unquote normal activities, economic activities will have to be there. I think the approaches in order to opening up can take three forms. One is that we have to do it in phases. We cannot open up the whole economy at the same time. We cannot open up the production side of it, the service side of it, and particularly just open up all the malls and the shopping plazas at the same time. I think if we look at the industries, if we look at the production processes, let us identify which are the ones which are safer to open, which are the ones where most of the poor people are engaged, which are the ones which can provide income to people who are poor and marginalized. And I think if we can set some criteria and the timeline, then we can open up the economic activities phase by phase. The second point is, even if we do that in a country like Bangladesh, which is heavily populated, population density is very high, the whole question of social distancing is not very well received, then we have to depend on public health issues, because COVID-19 is not a medical issue, it's a public health issue. So if we can raise the awareness about public health in terms of washing hands, in terms of taking other safety measures, wearing masks or wearing gloves, that kind of thing, then we can minimize the kind of both the infection as well as death from it. So I think it's a combination of phasing the economic activities and coupled with awareness about public health and taking action into it, and then we can see how we can go. We can also get some of the lessons from some of the economies which have opened up and see how they have done it. There are risks, but then we can minimize those risks, because there is no other way that we can move forward without opening up the economy. We talk about saving lives, but saving lives would also mean that we have to save the economies, otherwise lives would not be saved. The second issue that I want to take about is the whole question of the inequalities. I think that's very important. In terms of when we are having this pandemic, we have seen, at least from the initial researches, that it is not affecting all groups in a society the same way. One is that the poor and non-poor divide that we have already talked about. Those who have savings, who have constant sources of income, can lock themselves up within the household. They may not have to go out, but the people who depend on daily wages, on daily work, will have to go out. And in that sense, they are more susceptible to catching the virus also. And that has happened in many countries where poor people have been more affected than the richer people. At the same time, ethnic minorities have also been affected. This is very initial research in many countries. In Britain, 1 in 3 people are from ethnic minority. In the United States, 1 out of 4 people affected and who died is from African American segment of the population. So I think in terms of the infection, in terms of the death, there are inequalities. There are also differences. Women versus men. Men are dying more than women. Old versus young, that we are also seeing there. But then in terms of the impact of the COVID-19, socioeconomic impacts, I think we have not done the research as yet. We don't have the information, but some of the things one can think about. One is that when things open up, we'll see that it would be the small farmers, it would be the small entrepreneurs, it would be the small shopkeepers who have been affected most, because they have lost their savings, they have lost their businesses, and to cope with it and come back, it is very difficult for them. It is very difficult for them because they don't have the cushion. And I think, and I'm afraid that when this the government packages come up for helping different segments of the population, they may be just hijacked by the vested interest in any country. And if that happens, that kind of situation would create a kind of an inequality. I'm also very much concerned that with the lockdown and everything, within the households, there are gender differences. There are gender differences in terms of division of work. There are gender differences in terms of food intake. And there are also issues of violence, domestic violence. And this is something that we cannot avoid. There is some research in Bangladesh where we have found that there are newer cases of domestic violence within the household. And I think that gender dimension, not only in terms of violence within the households, but how they are going to cope up. Women who have been working when things get better, it will also be an issue. There's a specific question on Bangladesh and how to provide credit to small entrepreneurs and small shopkeepers, to small producers. And the question has been raised that should we give it to the bank through the banking system, there are leakages and there are different kind of problems there. Of course there are. But at the same time, I think we have to think that the outreach of the banks or the banking system in a country like Bangladesh is far more than the outreach of any other organizations. So let us look at some of the problems that are there in the bank. There's the problem of corruption that we all know, but let us also look at it and then see how we can use that particular instrument actually to provide the kind of the credit to those who need them. We can also think of using some of the NGOs who have their own financing mechanism and their credit system, and use that NGO mechanism to provide credit to some of those who need them, and particularly the people who are poor and marginalized. I'll stop at this point.
Let me add a few thoughts here. On the financing, I think, one way to get out of crises like this was always been this big Keynesian sort of fiscal stimulus, right? But after the 2008 financial crisis, I think the monetary policy has also loomed large. So it's probably a combination of fiscal and monetary policies that would need to be resorted to come out of this thing. In Nepal, there's great demand. The cost of borrowing has been so high. The interest burden on the part of entrepreneurs, the firms, has been exceptionally high, and that's probably been the #1 demand. So how do we lower the overall economy-wide cost of borrowing, the lending rates, the base rates, and if there's room for also subsidizing interest of the most hard-hit sectors? And if you do some maths on the SMEs, for example, what is the cumulative borrowing that they have? Even if you provide just 10% of the working capital in proportion to how much they have borrowed at, let's say, 12, 13% of interest rate, how much would it take to create that, let's say, a special purpose vehicle to provide concessional working capital? For the larger borrowers, again, interest subsidy has been a big demand. For workers in the informal sector who has been laid off, who've possibly gone back to their villages or peri-urban areas, it has to be addressed through social protection, the expansion of social protection, including guaranteed employment schemes. So the 100 days, which you can, rather than just giving money for nothing, you exact some kind of a capital formation, the small rural works in the villages. On aid flows for Nepal, grants have always been very, over the last 5-6 years, have become almost insignificant. Is the concessional loans that funds a lot of the infrastructure projects. That's not going to change in the immediate run. The Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, if anything, the sources that we can tap have actually diversified, with the AIIB coming, the Exim banks of a number of countries, including Australia. That option is there. Risks of opening up, the traditional menu we've been going through is, okay, how far are the vaccines? What is the situation with the antivirals? And if both of them are sort of far-fetched, if you analyze 500 years of evidence on how pandemics have ended, and there was a nice story in the New York Times the other day, the only one disease that has been eradicated through the invention of the vaccine was the smallpox. All others, it's the fear epidemic that, we learn to live with it. And so this is where the herd immunity comes in. And that's probably the direction that states are leading their country towards, without openly declaring that this is the path that we've taken. But of course, how do we protect the most vulnerable and open up in a very responsible, sequenced, gradual manner is the issue. Tourism bubble in South Asia will be very hard because of the sort of the intertwined nature of our economies, the movement. I think this needs a very secure corridors where you can really do foolproof 100% sort of checks, rigorous testing and all that. And this is possible in a remote area like the Tasman area. But in South Asia, given our population dynamics, it's probably going to be hard. Inequality, feminization has been taken care of. On the larger issue of rethinking liberalization, globalization, I think this needs a separate kind of a Zoom session on its own. Definitely, I think the original raison d'etre for reforming the state, for going for greater integration, which has led to tremendous productivity enhancements, reductions in poverty, that's not going to go away. That can't be discredited. But certainly the role of the state, a stronger, effective regulatory state, public provisioning of essential services, rethinking food security, rethinking energy security, rethinking some of these core issues of self-reliance, I think have to be looked into and responded to. Thank you. And I do need to rush to another call, so I take leave from here. Thank you.
So,
No, I was just going to say that let me pass that back on to Cicero. And although there are questions still coming in, but we've kind of run out of time. So my apologies to those whose questions we have not been able to pass on to the speakers. Please feel free to reach out to them. Their email addresses are readily available. So perhaps that's worth doing. And with that, let me pass it back on to Cicero.
thanks, Gaurav. And first of all, very quickly, let me thank the 4 panelists. Well, Nadeem has had to leave. Ganesh, it's great to see you. We'll certainly keep in touch. And Salim and Swanim, and the audience for participating in this. I just want to make couple of quick announcements. One is that the recording of this will be available online, hopefully by the end of tomorrow, but certainly the day after, we think. And next week, on the 2nd, we will have Jeff Sachs talking about COVID-19 in a more global perspective. And on the 9th, Tuesday, the week after, we will have a webinar on food security with 3 experts drawn from IFPRI and FAO and from India who have worked on these issues. So I hope that you would also continue to be engaged in this series. And we have several coming up, and we're still planning more. So all the best to all of you. And yeah, we don't know how this virus would go, but please take care, because there's always the downside risk that it could be very bad. There could be second waves, all kinds of things. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.